Thank you, members of the Assembly, senators, Assembly members, particularly Senator Hannan, O'Mara, Assembly members Gottfried and Engelbright for calling these hearings, as well as Senators Larkin and Assembly member Scartatos for advocating on behalf of the city of Newburgh. The city of Newburgh is situated about equidistant between New York City and Albany. We are the only deep water port between these two great locations. It's a place where the sweet and the salt water meet, and through a historic scouring, we now have the tremendous asset in the city of Newburgh. In addition to its people and the resiliency of them, we have a police department that's being regarded now as one of the Cinderella police forces in the state of New York by no less than Commissioner Green. We have gone in the Ferguson era into a progressive way in meeting the community's needs with a police-community relationship. In addition, as one of the great assets of our city is Washington Lake. In this era of increasing freshwater scarcity, we fully expect in the next century that Washington Lake is going to be a key economic development tool for the city of Newburgh. We anticipate it, we will bank on it, and we want to plan for it. And it's around this discussion of what it is, it's in our hopes and our aspirations that I want to frame our experience with this water crisis. I've heard from Mayor Borges' experience in Hoosick Falls. In many ways, the city of Newburgh made a lot of core decisions based upon a lot of the ambiguity that surrounded the direction that the mayor of Hoosick Falls and the community received as it related to the water quality. Before the beginning of this year, I could not have ever pronounced perfluorooctane sulfonate, also known as PFOS. At the time, the EPA had considered PFOS to be an emerging contaminant, not subject to federal regulation. It was described as being extremely persistent in the environment, resistant of typical environmental degradation. Sampling done in 2014 identified PFOS as a contaminant, but at levels that were below the then existing EPA short-term health advisory of 200 parts per trillion. In March 2016, the DEC resampled and then advised the city of the continued presence of PFOS in the water supply. And although the levels were still below 200 parts per trillion, at the time we were measuring at 150 parts per trillion. Reading up on the medical science behind PFOS, just the mere fact that it's measured in parts per trillion seems to speak to its potency as a cancer-causing agent. And so we began to seek direction in terms of what this meant and how we should act upon it. There are many other steps, but ultimately it resulted in the awareness that we were not getting straight direction from either the federal or the state agencies. And while we understood that we had a very potent, caustic, toxic substance, the city of Newburgh needed to act. Again, not only referring to Hoosick Falls, but also Flint, Michigan. I made the call to declare an emergency on May 2nd, 2016, requiring the city to restrict its water usage, and gave broad powers to the city and all agencies to act to switch to alternative source waters that were free of the PFOS. On that particular day, after a tremendous amount of hard work, weeks leading up to it, we switched from Washington Lake over to Browns Pond. We were fortunate in that we had an alternative source of water, but it was a very finite source of water, as we soon drained that lake, that pond, down to levels that were threatening to stress the aquatic life and amphibious life in that pond. Fortunately, again, we are located by the Catskills Aqueduct, and we were then able to switch to the Catskills Aqueduct. In the interim period, in May of 2016, the EPA also set the new long-term provisional health advisory at 70 parts per trillion, which really helped make the team in the city of Newburgh feel vindicated when they had declared the emergency. So in June of 2016, we ultimately switched over to the New York City DEP's Catskill Aqueduct. Now I just want to bookmark for a moment that the Catskills Aqueduct is due for repair, which is scheduled ahead of the Delaware Aqueduct repair. We want to repair, New York City wants to repair the Delaware Aqueduct first, so that we can then be used to feed the water supply of 3 communities in that area, while they then go and do the more laborious work on the Delaware Aqueduct. And that will come into play here shortly in what I'm laying out for the committee. And then ultimately in August of 2016, the DEC declared the Air National Guard base at Stewart Airport a state Superfund site. I do want to focus on some of the actions that the agencies, New York agencies, have taken that we believe were successful. The governor's task force, comprised of both the DEC and the DOH, clearly defined the presence and concentration of PFAS in Washington Lake, Silver Stream, and at discharge points at the Air National Guard base. At one area called Wreck Pond near the Air National Guard base, the measures are in the levels of 5,900 parts per trillion for PFAS. As of this day, that water still flows down. We had to close our diversion gate at Washington Lake for reasons I'll explain momentarily. But that water carrying those loads are going down Silver Stream to the Moodna Creek, ultimately to the Hudson River, and to points beyond in the Atlantic Ocean. With the cooperation of the New York City DEP, we were able to switch over to the Catskill Aqueduct water within several weeks. We changed our filtration panels, our testing panels to match the chemistry in the Catskills water, and we are very pleased to report that since May of 2016, we have tested negative, PFAS-free in our water, simply because we shut down Washington Lake, one of the key resources for the city of Newburgh. The DEC in the interim period has agreed to reimburse the city for the cost of the Catskills Aqueduct water until such time as the aqueduct is then taken offline, which is estimated to be in October 2017. Other successes is that the DEC has undertaken the design and construction of a directed pipe connection from the aqueduct to our filtration plant to ensure that our source water can be transmitted efficiently, especially through the winter months. The DEC has also agreed to undertake the design and construction of a granulated activated carbon water filtration system to enable the city to resume the withdrawal of source water at some point from Washington Lake when the Catskill Aqueduct is shut down. The DEC has also undertaken the installation of a portable granular activated carbon filtration system to enable the city to pump water out of Washington Lake. So since we're no longer using Washington Lake, the freeboard has continued to rise in Washington Lake. This is a high-hazard Class C earthen dam built over 150 years ago. And the spillway is inadequately designed to accommodate the volumes of water based on the rates at which the water is rising. We have telemetry at Washington Lake that shows that at the point that I declared the emergency and thus shut off Washington Lake from being utilized as a city's source of water, that water has risen steadily and precipitously towards the 2-foot line, in which point we're going to start spilling over. The risk is that once we overcome the capacity of the spillway, it's going to rise further, and once it crests the earthen dam, it could ultimately cause washout. The DEC, again, as a success, is working now feverishly to establish this mobile granular activated carbon filtration unit so that as we pump the water out of Washington Lake, we are not going to discharge onto our neighbors in the town of New Windsor what has befallen us from Stewart Airport. Just for topography, Stewart Airport is approximately 150 feet below Washington Lake. And for a matter of history, and something that we're still looking for, is the comprehensive reportage from both federal agencies as well as state agencies that tell us what has been dumped and what has been going on at the Stewart Air Force Air Base. We understand that it's not only PFOS that we should be concerned about. This has been a historic dumping ground for well over 50, 60, 70 years. And as one of the senators referred to earlier this morning, I believe the term was that there is a galaxy of contaminants. And right now, all we're really looking at and talking about is PFAS. And so it looks like a narrow pinprick of a hole through which we are shielding ourselves from other critical data that may ultimately impact both the health questions we want to ask as well as long-term monitoring protocols required for the city of Newburgh's residents that have been drinking this water for a very long time. It is an understatement to say that there has historically been a lot of distrust in government, municipal government, and beyond in the city of Newburgh. It is also very important to emphasize that we are rebuilding that trust. And at the very moment this PFAS crisis has befallen us, We are expected as local leaders to speak the truth, to ask the harsh questions without regard to politics and without regard to how this is ultimately going to be handled. We're starting to get a sense that there's going to be a bit of a ping pong between the federal agencies and the state agencies. Indeed, nationwide, to the extent a lot of this contamination seems to originate from military airports, this is just the point at which people are starting to start their engines and rev their engines. And so while the city of Newburgh has benefited from Hoosick Falls, many others may ultimately benefit from the experience that the city of Newburgh has with regard to how it is treated by both the federal and state agencies. We simply want to know what else may be in our water, what else may be in our water beds, our sediment beds. We are concerned that we may ultimately still have a contaminated vessel, which is Washington Lake, which is our core asset for this city, for the community going forward. And all we're going to be told is that, well, you have the filtration system. You shouldn't worry about the long-term permanent damage. We want Washington Lake cleaned up. We want it restored to what it should have been, but for this contamination that has landed on the city of Newburgh for an indeterminate amount of time, but which we fully expect goes well beyond 2 or 3 decades. We understand there's a closed municipal landfill there from the town of Newburgh. We understand that there are private entities. We understand that there are public entities. It is very important for us to emphasize to this panel that what distinguishes Newburgh, we believe, from Hoosick Falls, the term earlier today was corporate polluters, is that in this instance, we believe that it may also be land owned and or operated by the state of New York that's also involved in this. And so while we have no reason to question the integrity of Mr. Brand and his team, we know that in any other analysis where someone ultimately has the possibility of having to pay out sizable damages, that they shouldn't necessarily be in charge of conducting the testing or doing any of the measures that ultimately may impact their pocketbook. Similarly, we understand there's a dilemma because in also the federal agencies, there is the federal liability from the Department of Defense standpoint. What we have been told thus far is there is no independent agency, short of perhaps a litigation system itself, which will enable us going forward to try and discern the truth. The problem for the city of Newburgh is that we operate on razor thin margins. Many of you may recall a number of years ago the city was near bankruptcy before draconian measures were implemented that I'm proud to tell you today have us on stable financial footing going forward. But we do not have the capacity to be able to wait out extensive long-term litigation while we wait to be reimbursed. And so while we are being reimbursed for the New York City DEP water, we're concerned about the actual expenses we've thus incurred in the amount of $157,000 that we expect by the end of this year could go as high as $276,000. We're also concerned that with hurricane season upon us, despite the rate at which we're discharging that water, we also have the continuing discharge from the airport. And since we closed our diversion gate to reduce the water, the freeboard that's rising in Washington Lake, that water that's being contaminated at a rate of 5,900 parts per trillion at the airport is going straight down Silver Stream to the Moodna and beyond. We know, we've been told that there are wells downstream in the town of New Windsor. We do not want to see these wells be contaminated. And what we would ask for is the same mobile granular activated carbon filtration technology that's being utilized at Washington Lake to reduce the freeboard could also be mobilized at Wreck Pond, which is the source of some of the highest contaminants up by the airport. This would at least protect the town of New Windsor. It would ultimately protect the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. I heard a question, Assemblyman McLaughlin, earlier that was posed about testing, blood testing for the residents of the city of Newburgh. And I will tell you that I have played and replayed the answer you were given, and I'm still not clear as to why we need to wait for any federal agency to initiate this testing. Again, going back to the historic distrust in the city of Newburgh, there is a narrative that's being asked, is that why is other communities getting the testing and the city of Newburgh is not? What is it that makes our community different? Why isn't it that this contaminant that we have found in our water source does it immediately call for absolute action to get the testing we need, to get the long-term monitoring. Back in July of 2013, I posed this request to Dr. Zucker, the Commissioner of the New York State Department of Health. Many of our council members are being asked by their residents whether the city or the state is going to offer blood testing and the health assessment programs to help residents understand the significance of the exposure they've already experienced. At our public health meeting sponsored by the EPA recently, many residents asked the same question. We had very emotional testimony, one from a member of our engineering department, not someone that's flown to flights of logical fancy. He basically said both of his children gestated drinking the water in the city of Newburgh. That their mother drank the water and he wants to know how can they get tested. The answer at that time was, well, go out, talk to your doctor. The truth of the matter is that most doctors don't know about PFOS. Most laboratories in this area do not test for PFOS. We do not have laboratories presently. I've made the offer that we will make municipal space, so help me if it's in my own office, so that we can do this testing. And it's something that we are eager to get started as quickly as possible. We understand from actually one of our fire captains in the Newburgh Fire Department, who's a chemist, that there are 3 laboratories that may be able to assist, that the local laboratory has been in contact with. One is Vista Analytical Laboratory in El Dorado Hills, California, ALS Kelso in Kelso, Washington, and Pace Analytical Ormond in Ormond Beach, California, or excuse me, Ormond Beach, Florida. The point is that I would like to see this mobilized as quickly as possible before a narrative of distrust is perpetuated in our community. And I would say that we welcome some partnership with federal agencies, but what we really want is action now. We want action to immediately begin testing so that we can try and manage the question marks that keep coming at us. These are not irrational questions. These are people who have been drinking the water for 20 and 30 years. Some residents have had family losses to cancer in the past. Whether they're causally linked, we do not know. But a lot of unease and anxiety in our community could at least be addressed if we are able to get the testing. As I mentioned earlier, the city has $157,000 in unreimbursed costs. The DEC has not yet committed to reimburse the city for the out-of-pocket expenses related to the contamination. Also, the DEC has not been willing to tap into the Superfund to reimburse the city for its response expenses, explaining to us that they prefer to wait for the Department of Defense to give a response. In a city that has the kind of margins and the reserve funds that can wait for that answer, more power to them. But in the city of Newburgh, we have a problem with cash flow, and we need all of those monies reimbursed as quickly as possible. I want to back up and also mention that it's not only the city of Newburgh's residents that are asking for testing. I speak on behalf of firefighters that have worked at Stewart Airport, that have trained with this PFOS foam, firefighting foam, for the last 20 years, that have asked as well for the testing. They have worked with this foam, they have breathed it, they have had it on their skin. And thus far, they have been given the same response as firefighters up at Stewart Airport that we and residents in the city of Newburgh are being given. And as time goes on, the questions are only going to get louder and the request is going to be made. We do not have the funds. We do not necessarily have the health insurance coverage. And more importantly, it is my impression after just the brief conversations with pediatric specialists and others at St. Luke's Hospital that they're more than happy to help out. They just need the training for it as well. I would love to be able to open the doors at St. Luke's Hospital to the firefighters at Stewart Airport who have been working with this stuff and training with it for the last 20 years. Presently, there is no agreement between New York State and the Department of Defense to have the federal agency take responsibility for remediation and reimbursement and to memorialize what those remedial measures may be. The city has also requested to be permitted to participate in the discussions between the DEC and the Department of Defense, but thus far we are being told that we will not be admitted to those discussions. The city has also not received any information from the Department of Defense yet on how they plan to address the contamination on both the designated portion of the airport and the watershed, which includes the Class A tributaries and the drinking water reservoir. I need to conclude my comments by just speaking briefly on our watershed. First of all, it's shocking to many of us that our watershed has been misclassified. The tributaries leading to our water system themselves have been misclassified as designated by Class C and Class D streams, when in fact the tributaries go straight to the primary source of drinking water for the city of Newburgh. One of the highest priorities, in my opinion, is this apparent misclassification of tributaries to Washington Lake, Silver Stream, and Bronze Pond. The error designating them as Class C or D streams appears in Speedy's permit, New York number 00250-457 for the Stewart Air National Guard Base, for which a renewal application is still awaiting action by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Although I'm not certain regarding the number of years of this critical oversight, I want to inform this panel that the existing permit incorrectly recites the receiving waters for the Air National Guard discharges as Class C or D, despite the fact that most, if not all, of the discharges come into the city of Newburgh's drinking water. In addition, there are some direct tributaries of Silver Stream upstream from the diversion to Washington Lake that are also incorrectly classified as Class B streams. This is puzzling to us because the NYDEC maps correctly designate them as Type A streams, and yet the Speedy's permit has been allowed to be incorrectly classified. We believe that if it were designated as a Class A stream than it is, this whole mess maybe would have been discovered a lot much longer ago, much sooner than now, forgive me. The other thing that is striking that speaks to possibly the work of this assembly going forward is the way in which our watershed generally is managed. The way I've explained it to my own son is that imagine a funnel, and at the bottom of the funnel is Washington Lake. Right now, this watershed includes the major intersections of I-87 and I-84, very, very valuable land that has been, in our opinions, developed without any regard whatsoever, no response regulatorily in a way that's effective for the city of Newburgh and its protection of its watershed. Most recently, this would include a huge warehouse that's in the process of being constructed during this very crisis at the intersections of I-87 and I-84 that we believe are effectively going to wipe out Patton Brook. Patton Brook is a major stream, brook rather, that develops into the water that feeds Washington Lake. And at the end of the day, we're trying to get a sense of what is our measure of damages, what is our scope of damage, not only with regard to how the watershed has been mistreated, but how the crucial asset for the city of Newburgh, that being Washington Lake, is not only going to be remediated, but also going forward regulated. We are told that it isn't just the city of Newburgh that has a lake that's outside of its municipal boundaries. And that's a very important point for us. The town of New Windsor and the town of Newburgh actually occupy the land that encompasses Washington Lake, which means that when we want to work on watershed, there is no regulatory opportunity for us to do so with teeth that is enforceable going forward. And so just as the most latest construction project threatens to wipe out Patton Brook, and we don't have the finances to work on the legal analysis to determine our full measure and scope of damages, we find the city of Newburgh being neglected in ways that treats a marginalized population as not important enough to address this issue. And what we're asking for from this assembly, that we would ask for an outgrowth of this meeting today, to be that when we talk about the watershed, when we talk about the way water funnels down into lakes throughout the state of New York, that you would utilize the city of Newburgh as an example of the antiquated way in which our regulations for watershed maintenance throughout the state have been regarded actually by our private legal counsel, George Rodenhausen, as Victorian. He says, and we agree, that the time is long, long overdue for a comprehensive watershed maintenance program, watershed enforcement, watershed protection that will value the freshwater bodies throughout the state of New York that many believe fresh water, not oil, is going to be the source of conflict for the next century. We should treat it as what it is, and we should get in front of this and utilize this crisis and this confusion as an opportunity to move forward, I would hope, as the most progressive state in the Union. Where New York may have come from behind, suddenly we could lunge forward and actually acknowledge these problems, have a constructive dialogue with the federal partners regarding their airports, as well as those that have nothing to do with federal agencies. And for this era, use this crisis to precipitate solutions to what maybe the 3 Mile Island or the Love Canal was to other eras' leadership crises. We want to have the speedies permits corrected at Stewart Air National Guard. We want investigation of stormwater outfalls feeding Washington Lake. We want maps that are accurate. We would like the creation of an accurate Washington Lake watershed map. And again, we request the New York State Department of Health to assess the current threats to our drinking water sources. We are aware that the New York Department of Health Source Water Assessment Program was not funded on a continuing basis. We would ask for that funding now. Given the current PFAS-related damage and the increased vulnerability and sensitivity of our watershed, which includes the mounting threats posed by the development I mentioned earlier, we believe that a focused, detailed, and updated plan is needed, and an enforcement mechanism must be immediately identified. In 2005, the New York State Department of Health was tasked in the Source Water Assessment Program under the Safe Drinking Water Act with assessing threats to surface drinking water sources. The assessment provided to the city of Newburgh is both inaccurate and badly out of date. The city would deeply appreciate all of your assistance and that of the Department of Health in immediately performing an update to that assessment for use as a critical tool as we navigate forward together through this drinking water contamination crisis. In closing, we want to thank you again for taking the time to hear from us. Consider us the guinea pigs. We are the first ones in, but we are certainly not going to be the last ones. And we would absolutely hope that you would treat the city of Newburgh as the visible, prosperous, aspiring community filled with hope, and is going to indeed, like our police department, be the Cinderella story in the Hudson Valley. We guarantee it. Thank you.